My son George has always had the strangest friends. I've never really understood why, but when he was younger, he always seemed to attract the weird kids. I've got tons of stories about it, but one in particular still sticks out like a sore thumb. George was in 4th grade when my husband got reassigned and we had to move. That meant a new school for George. He'd always been outgoing and friendly, so my husband and I weren't too worried about him fitting in. The move went smoothly and everything at school seemed to be going great. I was actually thrilled when I met all the other parents. Everyone seemed so nice and normal. A few months after we'd settled in, I got a call from the school in the middle of the day. They asked if one of George's parents could come in to discuss an incident involving him and another student. My husband was at work, so I went. On the way there, I felt a mix of anger and confusion. Angry, because I figured George had gotten into a fight, something I'd need to deal with. But also confused, because fighting just wasn't like him. When I picked him up, he wouldn't say a word about what had happened, which was very unlike George. Normally, he's super chatty, a total oversharer, so his silence really threw me off. I figured he was embarrassed or scared, so I didn't push too hard. At the principal's office, George waited outside while I went in. The principal asked the usual questions. How George behaves at home, whether he listens, if he's respectful. I told him the truth. George is well behaved, polite, and never causes trouble. Then, the principal explained why I'd been called in. Apparently, George had gotten into a short altercation with a boy named Sebastian after recess. The two of them were the last ones outside, walking up the stairs, when George supposedly pulled an eraser out of his pocket and hit Sebastian on the head. Sebastian fell and started screaming. I was stunned. That didn't sound like George at all. Plus, he'd mentioned Sebastian before and always spoke fondly of him. They seemed like good friends. I asked for more details, but the principal didn't have many answers. No one had seen what happened, but both boys had told basically the same story. He assured me that George wasn't in any real trouble. Little scuffles happen, and said no further action would be taken. That helped calm me down. On the drive home, George still wouldn't talk. He only opened up later that night before bed, after I'd lost my patience a bit. That's when he finally told me what really happened. He said Sebastian had tricked him. They'd been playing make-believe, pretending to be in Street Fighter. According to Sebastian, George was supposed to pull out an eraser as part of a knockout move. When he did, Sebastian suddenly fell to the ground, acted hurt, and whispered that if George didn't pretend he'd really attacked him, he'd get hurt for real. So George went along with it, and of course, the teachers believed what they saw. I was furious. My poor kid had been manipulated and blamed for something he didn't do. Instead of going to the school, again, I decided to handle it myself. That night, I looked through the school directory and found Sebastian's mom's number. When I called, she introduced herself as Maggie. She was surprisingly kind and sounded genuinely nice. She said she'd already heard about what happened, gotten the truth from Sebastian, and punished him. I thought it was odd that he'd confessed that quickly, but I was relieved I didn't have to argue my case. Maggie explained that Sebastian had struggled with some behavioral issues and sometimes acted like another person. Honestly, the more she talked, the more I started to feel sorry for him. It sounded like he couldn't always control himself. Then Maggie suggested something I didn't expect, that George and Sebastian should have a sleepover to make up for the whole thing and rebuild their friendship. I thought it was a great idea when Maggie offered to host, and I really appreciated it. That weekend, I drove over to her house with George, who was back to his cheerful, talkative self. Maggie welcomed us in, and she and I got to know each other over a glass of wine while the boys played in the basement. Like I mentioned before, Maggie seemed like a perfectly decent person and I genuinely enjoyed her company. I stayed for a few hours and the time flew by. Eventually, though, I had to ask about Sebastian's behavior. It had been bothering me for a while. Her whole expression changed and she lowered her voice a bit. She told me he often struggled to make friends and had seen a few doctors, all of whom believed he'd grow out of it. She added that he'd been doing better lately, and the fact that he was becoming more social was a good sign. I didn't ask for many details. I just wanted to make sure my son would be safe for the night. Maggie promised George would be fine and that Sebastian wasn't violent. Just a little unusual sometimes. That was enough to reassure me. She seemed genuine, and honestly, it felt good knowing George might help Sebastian learn how to make friends. When it was time to leave, I went downstairs to say goodbye. The boys were laughing and playing Battleship, clearly getting along. I kissed George goodnight and headed home. The next morning, I went back to pick him up. He was already waiting by the door, smiling with his things packed. I assumed the night went well. I said good morning to Maggie, loaded the car, and we drove off. But a few minutes later, George suddenly burst into tears. I asked what was wrong, and what he told me completely floored me. He said everything had been fine until bedtime. They'd set up their air mattresses in the basement, side by side, and gone to sleep. But sometime during the night, George woke up. He didn't know why at first, until he heard whispering. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and a strange flickering light glowed inside. Not like a regular light, more like a candle. When George listened closer, he realized it was Sebastian talking, but he wasn't on the phone. He was talking to himself. Or rather, to the mirror, and he wasn't calling himself Sebastian. He was calling himself Mr. Jim. George froze. Sebastian seemed like he thought he was someone else, carrying on a full conversation with his reflection. Then, suddenly, the candle went out and everything went dark. George shut his eyes tight and pretended to be asleep. After a while, he heard the bathroom door creak open, and then whispering again, this time right above him. He couldn't understand the words, they didn't even sound like English. Eventually, Sebastian went back to bed like nothing had happened. By morning, Sebastian was completely normal again. George didn't dare ask him about it. When he told me all this, I was horrified. My gut said this wasn't just a kid's imagination. Something was seriously wrong. I called Maggie right away. At first, she laughed it off, saying Sebastian had always been a creative kid. But as I pressed her, her tone changed. Finally, she admitted his behavioral issues were more serious than she'd let on. One psychiatrist had even suggested signs of multiple personality disorder. She confessed they'd already moved twice before because Sebastian had been kicked out of school. I was stunned and furious. Why hadn't she told me? Why put my son in danger? Then she did something unexpected. She begged me not to tell the school. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her privacy, but another part of me knew something wasn't right. I just muttered, "Okay," and hung up. I told myself I'd decide what to do by the end of the week, but I never got the chance. That Monday, Sebastian attacked another student during recess. It was bad enough that the school sent a vague statement to all the parents, and by the end of the day, word got around that he'd been expelled. I tried calling Maggie, but her phone was disconnected. Just days earlier, we'd talked, and now she was unreachable. I didn't even know what I wanted to say to her, just that I needed to. But there were no other numbers or emails in the directory. A few days later, curiosity got the best of me, so I drove to her house. It was completely empty. No moving trucks, no signs of a rushed departure. Just gone. It didn't make sense. How could they have disappeared so fast? I searched online for any trace of them, but there was nothing. No forwarding address, no mention anywhere. It was like they'd never existed. That was a long time ago. George wasn't too badly affected. He's mostly forgotten it by now. But I haven't. I still think about that night and what might have happened in that basement. And I can't help but wonder what became of that boy, Sebastian.